So as Cindy mentioned, my name is Kate Bourne, and I am a PhD candidate as well as a med student at the University of Calgary. And so today I'm just going to talk a bit about postural tachycardia syndrome, which is the condition that I study in my PhD work. So I just wanted to start off with a simple cartoon to sort of illustrate what happens in standing when you're healthy and what happens when you're standing and you have POTS. So here we have our person here who is going to stand up. And so what you might not know is that when people stand up, gravity pulls about ½ liter of blood from your upper chest into your abdomen and legs. But in healthy people, the body adapts to this change normally and you are able to stand without symptoms. You probably don't even think about it when you're standing up. It's just a normal thing that you do every day. But sometimes things can go a little bit wrong. So in this case, when this person has stood up, something has not gone quite right. So in a person with POTS or postural tachycardia syndrome, when they stand up, the body has an inappropriate response. And so the patient experiences a rapid heartbeat, and they also have symptoms like lightheadedness, fatigue, and blood pooling in their lower legs, which is shown here, illustrated by the purple coloring in the lower legs. So if you've had a cold or a flu before, this might be something that you might have experienced when you're, you have a virus and you're not feeling well and you try to stand up and you can really feel your heart beating fast and you feel lightheaded and dizzy. That is similar to what patients with POTS feel like, except with POTS, it never goes away. So if you have a cold or a flu, you don't feel well for maybe a week, but then you get better. If you have POTS, you just feel like that always, every single time that you stand up. So it's really quite a debilitating disorder. And so I wanted to share a little bit about some of the physiology about what's going on here and why the heart rate is actually increasing. So cardiac output is a term that we use to talk about the amount of blood the heart pumps per minute. And so cardiac output is equal to the stroke volume times the heart rate. So stroke volume is the amount of blood the heart pumps out with each heartbeat, and heart rate is the amount of times the heart beats per minute. So you can see here, if you have a decrease in stroke volume, your heart rate is going to increase to compensate because you want to maintain an even level of, or you want to maintain the same cardiac output because if your heart isn't pumping out enough blood, your tissues aren't going to get enough oxygen and nutrients, and it's a very serious situation. So the reason why POTS patients have this really fast heartbeat is because there's blood collecting in their lower body. The blood is pooling when they're standing, and not as much blood is getting back to the heart, so their stroke volume is lower. So in a healthy person, why doesn't this happen? And it doesn't happen because of something called the Baro Reflex. And so what the Baro Reflex is, it's a way that the body can manage changes in blood pressure. So there are specialized receptors called Baro receptors, and they're located, as you can see here. So this is the aorta, which is the main artery coming out of the heart. And then these here are the carotid arteries, which go up into your head. So right here in the aortic arch, as well as here in the carotid sinuses, are these specialized receptors called Baro receptors, and they're stretch receptors. So when the blood pressure is higher, they stretch more. When the blood pressure is lower, they stretch less. And based on the amount that they're being stretched, they send different numbers of nerve impulses to the brain. So if they're being stretched more, they're going to send more action potentials, and the brain's going to recognize that as changes in blood pressure. So as I mentioned, these receptors respond to changes in blood pressure. And so if they detect the blood pressure is lower, so they're being stretched less, they're sending less nerve impulses to the brain, the brain is then going to signal the body to respond. So the body is going to increase the heart rate, and the blood vessels are going to squeeze tighter. So with the heart rate increasing, we're going to increase cardiac output because we know that cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. And if the blood vessels squeeze tighter, it's going to increase something that's called the systemic vascular resistance, which is just a fancy way of talking about the tightness of your blood vessels. And so when we look at blood pressure, we know that it's a product of cardiac output and systemic vascular resistance. So by increasing the heart rate and squeezing the blood vessels more, you're going to increase blood pressure. So when a healthy person stands up and gravity pulls blood down into the lower body, the body responds with this mechanism and you're able to stand without symptoms. So how does this all happen? So The Bearer Reflex is part of the autonomic nervous system. And so that can be thought of as the automatic nervous system. So it can be thought of as all the processes in your body that you don't think about. So breathing, heart rate, digestion, temperature regulation, things that you don't need to think about, they just happen no matter what. And so those are involuntary processes in the body. And so there's two main divisions. There's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And you might have heard that the sympathetic nervous system is considered like the fight or flight adrenaline system, and then the parasympathetic is rest and digest. So those are the two main divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And when the body responds to low blood pressure and we get that increased heart rate, increased vascular resistance, that's through the autonomic nervous system that those changes are happening. So this is just a figure here, just to show like all the areas where the autonomic nervous system is acting in the body. So on this side, we have the sympathetic nerves, and then on this side, we have the parasympathetic. So you can see there's a lot going on, a lot of important things in the body that the autonomic nervous system is helping with. But what we're sort of mostly gonna focus on today is changes to the heart rate. So we can see sympathetic nerves would come in and increase the heart rate, and the parasympathetic nerves would come in and slow down the heart rate. If you increase sympathetic activity, you're going to squeeze those blood vessels. And as well, sympathetic activity is going to increase secretion of norepinephrine and epinephrine, so adrenaline from the adrenal gland. So then this is just another look at the autonomic nervous system and specifically its action on the heart and blood vessels. So the sympathetic nerves, or fight or flight, usually uses norepinephrine and epinephrine as the neurotransmitters. They also act as hormones as well, and that's basically adrenaline. And through the sympathetic nerves, you're going to get effects on the heart rate, on the heart, and on the blood vessels. With the parasympathetic nerves, that's the rest and digest system. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter, and the parasympathetic nerves primarily target the heart. So the heart has both sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. The blood vessels just have sympathetic. So that's one sort of a little difference there between those two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Does that kind of make sense? If you have any questions or anything, just feel free to jump in at any point or put a comment in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer them. So then just coming back to the Baro Reflex again, so this is those specialized receptors that stretch in response to blood pressure and help the body regulate blood pressure. So this is just sort of a more involved diagram, but what you can see here is this is what was shown before. So this is the aortic arch, and this is a carotid sinus. And so messages from these receptors, depending on how much they're being stretched, are going to go here into the medulla of the brain. And then depending on what's going on, is the blood pressure too high or too low, then signals are going to be sent out to the target organs. So here, parasympathetic signals could lower the heart rate, or sympathetic signals could increase the heart rate. And then similarly, sympathetic signals here would squeeze those blood vessels tighter to increase blood pressure if the blood pressure was too low. So now moving into POTS. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background about the Bearer Reflex and the physiology of standing, because it's sort of one of the key parts of POTS and sort of what's going wrong here. So what is POTS? So POTS is a form of autonomic dysfunction or dysautonomia. So what that basically means is that something in the autonomic nervous system isn't working properly. And so we also say it's a form of orthostatic intolerance. And so what that basically means is that orthostatic usually just refers to like positional change, so sitting to standing, lying down to standing, and then the body just doesn't tolerate that well. So those proper mechanisms to cope with standing are just not working properly in patients with POTS. So when patients with POTS stand up, their heart beats too fast, and they also experience severe symptoms like lightheadedness, blurry vision, nausea, chest pain, and difficulty thinking properly. So it's really quite an unpleasant experience for patients with this disorder. POTS is estimated to affect 1 to 3 million Americans. We actually don't know the true number because when doctors go to diagnose a condition, they put in a special code into their system. And unfortunately, there's no code for POTS. So POTS often gets coded as random different things. So we estimate 1 to 3 million Americans. We don't know for sure how many. It might be more. It also primarily affects females of childbearing age, which is sort of something that's quite interesting. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it more in a bit, but it is just quite interesting that, it's over 90% of patients with POTS are female. And patients with POTS experience significant impacts in multiple areas of their lives. So it definitely is a disorder of standing, and that patients feel worse when they're standing up, but impacts to school, impacts to work, especially a lot of young students aren't able to go to school, they're not able to work. And that's because some of the symptoms of POTS definitely extend into all times. So the difficulty thinking properly, the fatigue, some of the gastrointestinal symptoms, it's not just when you're standing, it's all the time. So it definitely is something that is very debilitating for patients. So how is POTS diagnosed? So what is the diagnostic criteria? So the first criteria is that when you stand up, so when you change positions to standing, your heart rate needs to increase by 30 beats per minute or more within 10 minutes. So if you were lying down and your heart rate was 60, when you stood up, your heart rate would need to go to 90 or higher, and it would need to stay there for a sustained period of time. Now we say if someone is younger, if they're 12 to 19 years of age, their heart rate needs to increase more, and that's because when you're younger, it's normal to have a higher heart rate increase. It's just that higher heart rate is normal with younger people. So that's why it's higher when patients are younger. And as you get older, that gets lower. The other thing that's important is there shouldn't be any orthostatic hypotension. So what that means is that your blood pressure shouldn't drop abnormally when you're upright. So as we learned in that Bearer Reflex introduction, when your blood pressure is decreased, your heart rate increases to compensate. So what's interesting in POTS is that although the blood pressure is normal, the heart rate is increasing. So if someone had orthostatic hypotension, they would be diagnosed with orthostatic hypotension instead. So it's still a type of orthostatic intolerance. They just wouldn't meet the POTS criteria. So what's special about POTS is blood pressure stays normal, but the heart rate is still going up. In addition to the heart rate increase, patients also need to have those symptoms that I mentioned: lightheadedness, dizziness, shaking, chest pain, mental clouding. They need to feel unwell when they're upright. If you just have the heart rate increase and you feel fine, you don't have POTS. You need to have those symptoms that go with it. Symptoms need to be worse when you're standing. They need to get better when you're upright. And it also needs to be chronic. So what that means is, as I mentioned, if you've had a cold or flu, you've probably felt like this for a day or two, and that's not POTS. So it needs to be persistent, 3 months, 6 months, a long time that patients are having these symptoms continually. And we need to make sure that there isn't something else going on in the body that's causing those symptoms. So sometimes a medication might cause this, sometimes another medical condition might cause this, and we just need to make sure that the patients don't have that before we diagnose them with POTS. And yeah, just jump in with questions if you have any. So what causes POTS? So we say it is a disorder with a heterogeneous origin with multiple causative pathologies. And so what that basically means is that POTS is not just one thing, but POTS is likely multiple things. So all the patients have this presentation where their heart rate is increased and their heart's beating too fast, but they probably have different things going on in their body that are leading them to that end presentation. And that's what is still sort of underway in research, and it's not something that we fully understand yet. But there are some things that we've learned that are different in patients with POTS compared to people who are healthy. And so one of those things is something called hypovolemia. And so basically that just means low blood volume. So compared to healthy people, POTS patients sometimes have less blood in their body. And that can cause problems when you're standing and gravity pulls blood down. If you are starting with less blood anyway, that's going to cause a more severe response. So you're going to have more challenges with standing. Also, some patients have what's called a hyperadrenergic phenotype, and this just means that the levels of like epinephrine are too high in the body, and so that would cause tachycardia. That would cause your heart rate to beat too fast. And so we don't exactly know what's going on there, but that is something that some people have. Some patients also have neuropathy, which is like nerve damage. So in their legs, those sympathetic nerve fibers that help the blood vessels squeeze when you stand up to help maintain your blood pressure, those nerves are damaged. So when your body is signaling to squeeze those blood vessels together, that's not happening maybe because the blood vessels or the nerves are damaged. I could see how that might go along with hyperadrenergic phenotype if the body is producing like more and more more of a sympathetic response trying to get a reaction and it's not happening, that could cause those high levels. Another thing that's coming out in evidence recently is presence of autoantibodies. And so these are antibodies that target the body. So instead of targeting an invader like a virus or a pathogen or something like that, it's actually targeting your own body, and specifically possibly targeting parts of the autonomic nervous system. So some research has shown adrenergic receptors, so receptors in the sympathetic arm of the nervous system. There's antibodies that react with those receptors, as well as parasympathetic. So that could cause, if the antibodies are stimulating the sympathetic nervous system when they shouldn't be, you could get too much sympathetic activity, too much adrenaline, and a high heart rate. So these are some of the things that have been shown in research, but they're not consistent. So every POTS patient doesn't have neuropathy, or every POTS patient doesn't have autoantibodies. So this sort of lends into the thought that there could be multiple things going on. Another thing that's sort of coming in the research, which is quite interesting, is these other conditions that seem to be related to POTS. So one of them is called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and this is a connective tissue disorder that affects the collagen in your body. And another one is called mast cell activation disorder, and this is an allergy disorder where people have allergic reactions that are not appropriate. So it could be that the temperature changes, or that you're stressed out, or it's some sort of physical stressor causing, hives or flushing or even full anaphylaxis. So there is a relationship between POTS and these other disorders that we don't understand yet, but I think it definitely helps us understand where we need to take our research, if that sort of makes sense. The other thing that's interesting in POTS is this finding here. So this is something called dependent acrocyanosis. So here, this is a patient with their legs just sitting over a bed. And you can see, hopefully it shows well, that their feet are kind of purple red. And what this, I assume, physician is doing is they're pressing on the foot. And if they were to take their hand off, that area would be white. And so what this is, and I'll show you actually. So now this is the same patient, and now they've been flat for a while, and that coloring goes away. So this is really common in POTS when they're upright, that their legs and feet go purple. And so it's called dependent acrocyanosis, as I mentioned. And it's basically that the blood that's collecting in the lower body is becoming deoxygenated, and you're getting that sort of cyanotic blue purple color. And so this is really common amongst basically all POTS patients, and shows that there is evidence that that blood is pooling in the lower body. It's not getting back to the heart properly when patients are upright. But then, as you can see, when the patient is flat, it gets better. So it's definitely a disorder of being upright. So I want to talk a little bit about why, some thoughts about why POTS primarily affects female patients, because I definitely think it's a very interesting phenomenon. So we do know that there are sex differences in autonomic function between males and females. So males have a higher baseline sympathetic tone than females, meaning just normally at rest, they have higher levels of sympathetic activity. So when patients or people are upright, maybe the males have a better, the sympathetic nervous system function compensates better. So maybe females are just more likely to have a reaction like this because they have less of that baseline sympathetic activity. Also, there's sex differences in blood volume regulation. So we know that estrogen, female sex hormone, can reduce parts of the blood regulation system that increase blood volume. So it's called the RAS system. So estrogen might lower some of those components, which could lead to a lower blood volume, but then male patients wouldn't have that, action on their blood volume. We also know that females are physically smaller than males. So a smaller heart can actually lead to a lower stroke volume, and they also have less blood in their body. So that could also contribute to why females are more likely to have POTS. We also know that females are more likely to have an autoimmune disorder than males. So if the new autoantibody evidence that we're seeing in POTS, is a strong contributor, and that's something that's still sort of under investigation. It could be something like that females are just more likely to have an autoimmune disorder than males. So there's definitely some interesting things there to look at in terms of why. I also just wanted to put in a plug for the Canadian Institute of Health Research Sex and Gender training. I think that everyone should do it. It's really great training. It helps you understand sex and gender and how to incorporate it into research. And there's 3 different courses depending on what area of research you're in, or if you're you know, not in an area of research, but you're interested, you can do all of them. But basically just helps you to see how you can incorporate sex and gender in your research. And so it's something that's definitely very important in our lab, because we know that females are more likely to have POTS than males, and there's some sort of sex difference happening there. Is the training available? Is it free? Yes, so it is definitely free. This is the link here, but if you just Google CIHR sex and gender training, it will come up online. And yeah, you can do it. So if like course 1 is like if you're studying like in a basic science lab, so cells or things like that. Course 2 is like human participants, and then course 3 is like if you were looking at, if you got a whole bunch of like medical files and you were going through them and trying to find things. But you can do all of them or one of them, but I would 100% recommend it, and you can put it on your resume or your CV that you did it, and it will look good, because it's just becoming like a very important part. Sorry, this is a huge digression, but I really think it's important, because a lot of the time in research before, you know, females were ignored, and like all, you know, if you're doing a mouse study, like all the mice were male and not female, and then you know, females are not just small males. So I would recommend it, put it on your CV, and it will be very helpful. Okay, digression over. So, oh, and I seem to have like frozen. Okay, we're good. Okay, so what can we do to help patients who are having this orthostatic intolerance problem? They're not feeling well, they're upright, their blood is pooling. So there's a couple of different approaches for patients with POTS. So we can do exercise. Now, if someone is standing up and their heart rate is already beating at like 150 beats per minute when they're standing, if we tell them to go for a run, it's not really going to work out very well. So this is like a very gentle graduated exercise program, starting with like a rowing machine or a recumbent bike or some sort of recumbent exercise, and then building up from there. But what we can do with that is, you know, help strengthen the muscles in the lower body to help blood get back to the heart, like the muscles in the legs help squeeze blood back to the heart, and also sort of improve stroke volume and things like that. We also recommend a high salt, high fluid diet. So this is sort of very different than any cardiology advice ever, but we know that a lot of POTS patients have less blood in their body than normal. So if you eat a lot of salt and you drink a lot of fluid, you're actually going to expand your blood volume, and hopefully that will help a bit. If that's not working out, which is true in some cases, we can also use different medications targeting different things. So there's no medications that are approved for POTS specifically, but we can target things like with the fast heart rate, we can use a beta blocker, we can use a steroid called fludrocortisone, which helps increase blood volume, things like that. The other thing that we can use, and this is actually something that's a focus of my PhD work, is compression garments. And so the idea behind that is if there's blood pooling in the lower body that's stuck there, it's not getting back up to the heart, if we can squeeze externally, like with mechanical squeezing that blood back to the heart, then the stroke volume will increase and the heart doesn't have to beat as fast to maintain the cardiac output. So that's sort of the idea behind compression garments, and I will talk more about that. And hopefully some combination of this will help the person sort of feel a bit better when they're upright. And okay, I'm just like, if there's any questions, just feel free to jump in. So I want to talk now a little bit about our lab. So at the University of Calgary, we have an autonomic function lab. So what do we do there? So we conduct clinical research to learn about autonomic disorders. So with clinical research, we're looking at human participants that come into our lab and we're learning about their autonomic function. So I've included a link to our website as well. If you Google University of Calgary Autonomic Function Lab, it will come up. You can see a little bit more about what we're working on, our lab members, things like that if you are interested. So in addition to POTS, which is what I primarily am studying, we do study some other autonomic disorders. One of them is called vasovagal syncope. So this is fainting. It's a fancy way to say fainting. It's probably something that some of you have experienced. It's pretty common. And so this type of fainting happens when your heart rate decreases or your blood pressure decreases or both decrease, and the blood flow to your brain decreases so much that you faint. And so usually this is in response to something like, you know, sight of blood, or you're too hot, or you've been standing for too long. And then usually you faint and then you recover and then you're fine. It's not like a problem. Like sometimes people faint because they have a bad heart rhythm or things like that. In vasovagal syncope, it's not like that. It's just that your heart rate or blood pressure get too low, usually in response to some sort of trigger. The other thing that we study in our lab is something called orthostatic hypotension, which I mentioned, and this is a decrease in blood pressure. And so I think I said within 10 minutes of standing, but this should actually be within 3 minutes of standing. Your blood pressure is just going to drop too much. And usually what happens with patients with this is their blood pressure then drops so much that they faint or they have to sit down. But that is also something that we study. There's also a graduate student in our lab who's studying something called initial orthostatic hypotension, which is basically when you stand up. When you first stand up, you feel lightheaded and dizzy. You might get spots in your vision, but then it kind of gets better. But it is something that is what can be quite debilitating for some patients. And so that's something that we look at as well in our lab. So what types of research studies do we use in our lab? Or do we do in our lab? So we'll look at autonomic function in individuals with autonomic disorders, and we can compare that to healthy individuals. So how is the autonomic function different in people with a disorder compared to not? We can also test effectiveness of medications and other treatments. So we have one study right now that's looking at a new medication for orthostatic hypotension. And so we're doing studies to make sure, or to look and see if it's helpful. Does it work? We can investigate underlying mechanisms. So we can test the autonomic nervous system in different ways to see if we can try and figure out what's going on there. And we also learn about the patient experience. And so that's sort of an important part of our research as well, as in addition to looking at the physiology of how things are working, we want to know how the patients are experiencing POTS, what's important to them, how maybe we can help with our research. And again, our lab website is there if you were interested in checking it out. Yes, okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the equipment that we use in the lab. And so we do an electrocardiogram or an ECG, which is basically an electrical recording of the heart. And so this figure here just shows there's 5 different markings here. And so when we're setting up an ECG in our lab, we would put 5 electrodes in these places. And so this allows us to look at the heart rhythm in different ways. And then we use something called beat-to-beat non-invasive blood pressure. So probably most of you have had your blood pressure checked with a cuff on your arm, which is a totally great way to have your blood pressure checked. But as you might remember, if you have it done, it does take a while. The cuff needs to inflate, and then the cuff needs to deflate, and then you get a number. And so a lot of the time in our research, we want to see blood pressure changes much more quickly than that. If we're using the arm cuff, and it inflates all the way and then deflates, by the time the cuff is inflated and deflated, what we're looking for has probably already happened. So we're able to use this really cool thing called beat-to-beat blood pressure. And so this is here, there's a finger cuff right here on the middle finger, and it inflates and it shines a light, and it's able to use the waveform of the blood flow in the finger to calculate the blood pressure. So it uses some mathematical algorithm, and we're able to get instantaneous changes in blood pressure, and it's a continuous trace, which I will show in a later slide. And so in this way, we can see changes right away, and we can also use that waveform to calculate some advanced hemodynamics. So as I mentioned, stroke volume, which is the amount of blood the heart pumps out per beat, cardiac output, which is the amount of blood per minute, and then systemic vascular resistance, which is that squeezing of the blood vessels. And this way we can do it non-invasively. We don't have to stick anything in the participants. They just have to wear this a little finger cuff, and then we can get all of this information, which is really helpful. So something that we do commonly in the autonomic lab is something called a tilt table test. And so I really like this little cartoon. I think it explains it quite well. But basically what it is it's just a bed that you lie on normally, and then we can tilt it upright at different angles, and then look at how the body responds to that. And so why tilt table testing is nice is it's different than standing. So when you're standing, we consider that to be something called an active stand. And that's because your leg muscles are engaged, and your leg muscles are helping to return blood up to your heart. So the muscles squeeze and that helps the blood get back to your heart. But when you're on the tilt table and you're like strapped onto the tilt table, those muscles can't engage. And so we're able to look at how the body responds to standing without those muscles. So it's the autonomic function part of it. The other reason why it's nice is if the patient does faint, it's safer because they are attached to the table, they're not going to fall, and we can just lower the table down very quickly. So this is something that's very commonly done in our lab. And then this here is a picture of a summer student that we had. We were testing out a study. And so this is the tilt table, as you just saw in the last cartoon, upright. And then I've just labeled some of the things. So there's a compression garment on this this student because we were testing the compression garment for a study. So in a normal tilt table test, you wouldn't be wearing that. But we have a transcranial Doppler, so we're measuring the brain blood flow. We have some ECG leads here, so we're measuring the heart rhythm. This is that finger cuff that I mentioned for the beat-to-beat blood pressure. This is how we operate the tilt table. We measure pulse oximetry, so the amount of oxygen in the blood. This is our standard brachial blood pressure cuff that you've probably had before, so we use that to calibrate the finger cuff to make sure it's working properly. And then this is the tilt table straps here, just securing the person on, so if they happen to faint, they're not going to fall. And again, the compression garment is just the study that we were looking at here. It's not something that we would sort of normally put on someone unless we were studying that. And then you can see here behind, there's some monitors here. So this is something that we are looking at in real time. So here we're getting that beat-to-beat blood pressure trace. So you can see this waveform here. With each heartbeat, we're getting a blood pressure reading, which is awesome. And then over here, we have the heart rate. And then down on our computer here, which you can't see, we have then those advanced hemodynamics like stroke volume, cardiac output. So we're able to, as we're conducting a research study, see what's happening in real time. So that's sort of like the basic setup in our autonomic lab, and sort of for basically every research study that we do, we would use this equipment. There's some other autonomic tests I just wanted to quickly go over. So in addition to the head up tilt test, we do something called a deep breathing test, and we're looking for something called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which sounds really awful, but it's actually a good thing. I don't know why they picked this name, and it's really common that people will, sort of call, not me, but they'll call in a panic and be like, oh no, my ECG says respiratory sinus arrhythmia, but it's actually a good thing. So basically what this means is that as you breathe in and out, your heart rate speeds up and slows down. And so we are able to have patients breathe in a specific, breathe in for this number of seconds and breathe out. And we're looking for this because this is going to show us how the parasympathetic nervous system is responding, or is it working properly? So when you're younger, you have more pronounced respiratory sinus arrhythmia. As you get older, it kind of goes away. But this is a test that we do, and it is normal to have this happen. You can try it out, you can breathe in and out, and you'll feel your heart rate go up and then down. This test here is called the cold presser test. So basically we put the participant's hand into a bucket of extremely cold ice water. And so what we're looking at here is the sympathetic nervous system to respond. So, it's really cold, it's really uncomfortable, and we want to see that blood pressure increase. And that's how we can see that the sympathetic nervous system is working properly, is with that increase. And then one other test we do is something called the Valselva maneuver. And so this is basically where we have the participant exhale forcefully against sort of like pressure. So it would be like, and I wouldn't recommend trying it because it can make you lightheaded. I guess it's like blowing up a balloon would be an example where you're forcefully blowing air out. And so during that period of time, things happen to the blood pressure and the heart rate. So I won't get into too much detail, but basically with the pattern of blood pressure and the pattern of the heart rate, we can look at both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system responses. So basically we do this like collection of tests to make sure that the autonomic nervous system is functioning properly. So that's sort of like a quick overview of our lab. And then I just wanted to jump into a little bit about the research that I'm kind of working on for my PhD. So my POTS research has sort of two aims. The first aim is the impact of POTS on patients. And then the second aim is looking at non-pharmacological treatment options. And so by non-pharmacological, I just mean not a drug, or not a medication. So specifically, I'm looking at using compression garments. So the first aim is using something called the Diagnostic and Impact of POTS survey. And then the second aim is sort of a series of compression garment studies. So what is the diagnosis and impact of POTS survey? So this was a large survey that was made in partnership with Dysautonomia International, which is a patient advocacy group for patients with autonomic disorders, and they do many great things. They raise lots of money for research. They offer, patient conferences and patient outreach and things like that. And so there was a lot of patient input in the survey, what's important and what's not, which is really great. And our first publication from that. So actually the survey started before, I joined the lab, but I've been fortunate to be able to work on this project. So the first publication came out last year, and it is open access. So if you are interested in learning more, you can look it up and read the full paper. But I just have a couple highlights in the next few slides. So in this survey, we had over 4,800 participants, all diagnosed with POTS. And we did see that 93% of the patients were female. So that's sort of confirming our understanding that we know POTS is primarily female patients. The most common age of onset was 14 years of age. So it definitely is something that comes on for younger people, sort of early teens. What was really quite unfortunate was sort of what we learned about the diagnostic delay in POTS. So 75% of the participants were misdiagnosed before they got their POTS diagnosis. So they were diagnosed with something else before their POTS was recognized. That's like huge, 3/4 of the survey. The average diagnostic delay was also 5 years. So that's the time from when someone first saw a doctor for POTS to when their POTS was diagnosed. So that's extremely long, 5 years that they're sick. Maybe they're not able to work, maybe they're not able to go to school, they're not getting diagnosed. The other thing that's sort of unfortunate is that although POTS is primarily affects females, the diagnostic delay was 2 years longer in the female patients than the males. So that's definitely something that's quite surprising and not good. Also, 15% of the participants waited 10 years or more for a diagnosis. So there's definitely problems with recognition of this disorder and getting a diagnosis. And then this is a cute cartoon. This person here does a lot of cartoons, and one of the problems is that POTS patients look fine. They don't look sick, and so unfortunately, a lot of times it's like you look fine, you're not sick, and so that really is a contributing problem. 91% of participants reported they had lightheadedness, tachycardia, fast heart rate, and pre-syncope, which is those symptoms of fainting, before fainting. So that's the majority of patients, but what's also important is that there was a lot of other symptoms, stomach problems, neurological problems, allergy-like problems. So definitely providing us clues that in addition to those, classic POTS symptoms, there's a lot of multi-system involvement going on. And as we saw in that sort of early picture, the autonomic nervous system plays an important role in a lot of body systems. So it does kind of make sense that if something's going wrong in the autonomic nervous system, these other body systems could be affected. We also saw that 25% of participants reported they had Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So that's that collagen disorder that we know or we think seems to be related to POTS. And then 9% of patients reported they had mast cell activation syndrome. So definitely seeing those disorders pop up within the survey. And so just to quickly summarize that, so we know POTS patients have challenges with diagnosis. They report a high symptom burden, including multi-body systems. There are comorbidities present, and understanding how those comorbidities are related to POTS may help us understand what's going on mechanistically. And then, so this is just sort of like a very quick initial snapshot, and we have soon upcoming more papers coming out looking at economic impacts, social impacts, quality of life. The survey took participants like an hour and a half to do, so we have a lot of data and hopefully more publications coming soon. Then switching gears a little bit to compression. So this is sort of the other aim of my, my research. So why compression garments? So as I mentioned, there's blood pooling due to gravity in the abdomen and the lower body, and that if we can mechanically squeeze that blood and help it get back to the heart, that's going to increase the stroke volume, and your heart rate doesn't have to beat as fast to maintain cardiac output. So that's sort of the idea with that. And it can also be applied broadly to many patients with POTS. Even though we know that patients have different mechanisms going along, they all sort of have that like blood pooling issue. So we don't have to, identify a specific gene mutation or identify a specific problem and develop a drug. This is something that can be applied broadly now while we're still kind of conducting that research. So our research hypothesis was that compression garments would reduce heart rate and improve symptoms on head up tilt compared to no compression. And our study population we used was individuals who were diagnosed with POTS. So this was a clinical trial, meaning that we were testing compression garments as a treatment in POTS. And so we had a compression garment, which I'll show you in the next slide, that we could do up in 4 different ways that would simulate compressing all of the lower body or only just part of it. And so for each configuration of the garment, there was 1 10-minute head up tilt test. So in total, there was 4 10-minute head up tilts. It was a crossover design. So what this means is that each person did all 4 of the head up tilts. So in some clinical trials, participants might just do one part or the other, but in this case, participants did all 4 of the tests. And it was randomized. So what that means is that they did the different tests in different orders so that it wasn't, you know, we always did a certain compression garment first and therefore it was the best or the worst. We mixed it up just to reduce that possibility. And then what about blinding? So what does that, so blinding means that if you're studying like a new medication, you usually don't want the person who is running the study or the participant in the study to know whether or not they are getting that medication. So usually we will do like a medication and then like a placebo, which is like a sugar pill. So because if you knew you were getting the medication or you knew you weren't, that could influence your response. But in this case, because it's a compression garment that we're physically putting on someone and they can feel it, we weren't able to do blinding because the patients could feel the garment. So, so that is something that is part of the study, but it's also like a real life thing that patients would in real life know if they were wearing the garment or not. So this is the garment that we used. So these were the 4 compression conditions. So we had no compression as a control. And then we had just lower leg compression, abdominal upper thigh compression, and then full waist to ankle compression. And so in real life, this would be like compression socks. This could be like a pair of shorts, and this would be like a waist high tight. And we wanted to try the different conditions because sometimes, especially like in the summer, the compression garments are really hot and uncomfortable. And so if we could show that just, you know, this short type compression was good, then that could be an option for patients. So everyone did all 4 of these conditions. And then this is the same figure that we saw before, but this is just what my study would look like. So patients would be upright for 10 minutes 4 times, and we do up the straps on the garment different ways depending on the order. So our research hypothesis, as I mentioned, was that compression garments would reduce heart rate and improve symptoms during head up tilt compared to no compression. And so for our data analysis, and so I didn't include any figures, we're just submitting this for publication now, so it should be out soon, but it's not quite published. But basically what we did is we would compare the heart rates during head up tilt with no compression compared to the compression garment. And then we compared the symptom scores during head up tilt with no compression compared to the compression garment. And then that's how we did our analysis. And so it was a promising result, and we did see a good result with reduction in heart rate and symptoms. And so not published yet, but hopefully published soon. The full results should be out. Yeah, so just wanted to conclude. So POTS is a chronic form of orthostatic intolerance. It primarily affects younger women. POTS patients do experience significant impacts in multiple areas of their lives, and maybe that is something that isn't quite realized. And there are physiological differences that we've identified, but we need to do more research to really understand sort of what's underlying this condition. Yeah, and so I just wanted to acknowledge these organizations, our lab, Dr. Satish Raj is my supervisor, and the Raj Lab team, as well as these supporters of our research, and then the Vanier Scholarship that I have. So yeah, if there's any questions, I included our Twitter. So I have a Twitter, and the Raj Lab has a Twitter. If you're interested in following it, you can, and you'll see research updates and things that are going on in our lab.
Thank you, Kate. That was such a great presentation. And I like how you actually included the CIHR sex and gender training, since that's generally in science, like when you're first going into research, you're not really aware of all of the regulatory things that go on when you need to do research, especially particularly regarding human studies. So that was really great. Yeah, so if there's anybody who has any questions, you can feel free to unmute yourself, or you can post into the chat section. It looks like we have one question in there.
Awesome. Okay. Baroreceptor unloading. Yes. Okay. So basically that just means the baroreceptors are unstretched. So so if the blood pressure was lower and the baroreceptors were being stretched less, that would mean that they were unloaded. Hopefully that answers the question.
Is there any more? I had one just regarding exactly like if there's any correlation between like the older patients get, does it change like how they need to be treated? Like if they have any issues like getting the proper amount of exercise that might help them with their condition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's like a super great question. So I would say that's something that we don't know the answer to, but it's actually a study that we're doing upcoming is to look at over 20 to 30 years what happens. And I think it's just something that we don't have data for. Generally, as the patients get older, they tend to get better. To my knowledge, that sort of, as the physiological tachycardia kind of decreases, it improves. But definitely not something I have an answer for yet, but hopefully soon with more research. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I had a question. Hi, Kate. I'm
Hi.
Brian Wood. I go to the University of North Carolina, and I'm somebody who had POTS growing up, and now I'm helping set up a POTS clinic here in Chapel Hill.
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's really exciting. But one thing we see a lot of and that I dealt with personally was the symptom of brain fog. Mm-hmm. So kind of a fogginess with a challenge to like think critically. And I was wondering, have you all really studied any mechanism underlying that or any way to help treat that? Is it anything beyond like hypoperfusion with hypovolemia or something like that that's going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, that's sort of my level of knowledge of the brain fog is that the cerebral autoregulation problem or not enough sort of cerebral blood flow is what's going on. We do have a study in our lab looking at neurocognitive changes in POTS, but it's something that's sort of in the early stages, and we don't have any research coming out. Yeah, so it's something I don't know. There was a study recently by Amanda Miller and colleagues looking at attention and cognitive function in POTS, but again, not so much mechanism, but more just a finding. So yeah, definitely something that's super interesting to pursue in the future.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the question. Are there any more questions that anybody has? I think maybe one that might be interesting for people watching this after is maybe if you can comment how it is for you, like being a student who does research and who's also a med student, and the workload that is involved with that.
Yeah, so it's definitely unique at the University of Calgary. So I'm actually able to finish my PhD before I officially begin like the med school program. So they have like a joint degree program. So for me, I think it'll work out quite well in that I'm allowed the time, like even if it's like 2 years or 3 years that I need to finish the PhD before starting the MD program. In the meantime, though, we do research sessions and career sessions and things like that, sort of all together to continue. So yeah, Leaders in Medicine at the University of Calgary, I think is a really great program, because I imagine trying to do both at the same time would be very, very intensive. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Are there any other questions that anybody had? I guess another one, just like more related to your career path then would be, how did you kind of decide that this was like an area of research that you were interested in, like how you found the lab that you're currently working in?
Yeah, for sure. So autonomic dysfunction is something that I sort of experienced when I was younger. And so I had started out in microbiology, which is sort of quite different than POTS, but I sort of had a very specific interest. And I knew of Dr. Raj because I had read a lot of his papers, but he was down in the States. And then all of a sudden he was in Calgary. And so I contacted him and it just sort of all fell into place. So I think for me, it was a personal interest. But I would suggest, I mean, if if anyone sort of is in undergrad or late high school, if there's an area that interests you, don't be shy about reaching out to professors at your university. Just let them know that you're interested. And usually, especially in our lab, like we'll have first year students, and we have high school students who come in. So don't feel shy. I mean, I didn't do any undergraduate research at all, but so it's not a requirement. But if you're interested, don't feel shy. This would be my advice.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice, not to be scared of reaching out to somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah, feel free to ask if you have any questions. I guess one other one that I have, so what's like kind of something you might have wished that you told yourself, like when you were first getting into research, like to your younger self, some advice you might have?
I think probably like, especially like when you start grad school, to know that like, that your supervisor like has confidence in you and like they picked you for a reason. And I feel like the imposter syndrome is like very, very real. And you feel like, oh my God, like I don't know what I'm doing, I don't belong here. And so just to know that like it's normal to feel that way, but to know that you're there, for a reason and you're meant to be there kind of thing, I guess would probably be what it is.
I totally get that. I was like one day undergraduate, literally the next day I'm a master's student now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so does anybody have any other questions? I've posted, so we have 3 more webinars this month on the 17th, 19th, and 22nd, all from the University of Calgary. And if you click on the 3 dots that are next to the file button in the chat function, you can download the chat and it'll save everything in there to your computer. Yeah, if there are no additional questions, yeah, I'd like to thank Kate again for her really great talk on her research, and I hope everybody enjoyed it and got to learn more about kind of this autoimmune disorder and POTS in general. But yeah, thank you again so much, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their day and is coping to starting the new school year in these still strange conditions.
Yeah, and thank you so much for the opportunity and for everyone who came to listen.
Yeah, you're very welcome.